Welcome everyone to the third installment of West Virginia Rivers Coalition Climate and Water Lunch and Learn series. I'm Autumn Crow, staff scientist at West Virginia Rivers, and I'll be moderating this webinar. Researchers across our state are studying what the changing climate means to our region and how we as a society can adapt to better prepare. During the Climate and Water webinar series, West Virginia Rivers has hosted these state experts as they share their research and findings with the public. This week, we meet Dr. Nicolas Zégre, Director of the Mountain Hydrology Lab at West Virginia University. He'll be sharing his research on water security and climate change from a West Virginia perspective. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping items. This session is being recorded and will be available on our website. We are also broadcasting on Facebook. Please be sure you mute your microphone during the presentation. And following Dr. Zégre's presentation, there will be time for questions. You can enter your questions at any time in the chat box. So with that, Dr. Zégre, take it away.
Great, thank you. Can everyone hear me? Yes, okay. First off, I just want to acknowledge West Virginia Rivers for the incredible work that they do in truly moving West Virginia forward. And they do this by advocating for the health and wellness and opportunities for West Virginia citizens, as well as our ecosystems and our watersheds. And I also believe that West Virginia Rivers is one of the most important organizations in the state working in water and environmental health. And so if you haven't yet supported them, through your time and contributions, I highly encourage you to do so. I also would like to thank Autumn and Angie for the opportunity to share the work that I'm going to discuss today. And today we're going to talk about water security, climate change in West Virginia. And originally I was going to talk about both implications of climate change as well as opportunities, but given the limited amount of time, I'm going to focus on implications of what climate change means here in West Virginia. And then during the Q&A, I'm happy to discuss any opportunities associated with climate change. So the goal of this presentation is to provide you with the current state of understanding about what future climate looks like in West Virginia, and also explore the potential impacts and implications for West Virginia citizens. Oh, excuse me. I have also provided a document to West Virginia Rivers that provides a list of resources for understanding climate change in general, the climate change science, as well as specific resources for West Virginia. And also, if you're interested in having this presentation or future talks, don't hesitate to contact me, and I'm happy to share that with you. I'd also like to acknowledge funding that has supported this work, namely the National Science Foundation and the Appalachian Stewardship Foundation. So because of those organizations, this work has happened. So I want to start off with a takeaway. If you were to leave this talk today with a couple of points that I think are most important that you can use to understand climate change, but also use to communicate climate change, is that warmer air holds more water. This is a critical thing to understand about why climate change matters. The second thing is that the variability around climate is often more meaningful than long-term average conditions. We often hear about average annual temperature in the year 2100, and that's a hard thing to wrap our minds around. And so thinking about climate change from how variability is changing in time is often more meaningful. The critical point, especially for underserved communities in places like West Virginia and Appalachia and other communities of color, communities with a disproportionately large amount of people living in poverty, the critical thing to understand is that vulnerable communities will become more vulnerable as the climate changes. And then finally, you don't need data, models, or papers to know that climate change is happening. The mind and body are exquisite environmental sensors. Whether it be earlier springs, shorter winters, more intense precipitation events, 80-degree days in January, we all have experienced a changing climate. And so critically, if we open our eyes and open our body to experiencing climate change, it's not debatable. We all have experienced this. So it goes without saying that water is needed for drinking, but it's also important to recognize that water is embedded in our entire economy. It's embedded in the productions of goods and services to produce food, to produce clothes, technology, and energy. In fact, agriculture and energy production are the greatest users of water in the United States. And here in West Virginia, nearly 70% of our water withdrawals are actually for thermoelectricity. And so when we think about water security, we need to think about how changes in something like climate impact our ability to receive goods and services that we're dependent upon. It takes 174 gallons of water to produce a single pot of coffee. That's from growing the beans, from processing the beans, from providing water to workers, to transportation. The entire life cycle requires that much water. A single gallon of milk requires 264 gallons of water. A pound of cheese requires 660 gallons of water. A half-pound steak requires almost 2,000 gallons of water to make that steak for you. And if you're more environmentally conscious, you can drink more beer. 40 gallons of water is required to produce a single bottle of beer. It takes about 2,000 gallons of water to make a single pair of blue jeans. Interesting, in the time of COVID with remote work and all this, I can't see who's wearing pants, but we're all wearing some kind of pants. So think about, with the 180 people registered for this talk, how much water is embedded in producing pants. A smartphone requires about 3,000 gallons of water. Transportation, about 7 gallons of water per mile traveled in a car, or about 13 gallons of water to produce a gallon of petroleum. And then finally, water is needed for electricity generation, whether it's mining for coal, whether it's hydroelectric, whether it's unconventional gas development or growing biofuels. All of this requires water. So when we think about climate change and its impacts and policies to protect people, we need to also think about what it means for changing water as the foundation of our economy. So many of us know that West Virginia has a lot of water. This figure here shows the drainage networks in West Virginia. This is created by a colleague, Jackie Strager, here at WVU, and I think it's a really phenomenal image that shows the density of creeks, streams, and rivers we have in West Virginia. So we have about 54,000 miles of river. Let me move this. 54,000 miles of rivers in West Virginia. We are a headwater state, meaning that water that starts in West Virginia flows off of the Appalachian Mountain spine and provides water for communities or cities and economies such as Washington, D.C. Over here, it flows to Pittsburgh, and then it meets with the Ohio River and flows to the Mississippi River down to the Gulf of Mexico. Water that starts in West Virginia directly impacts around 6% of the US population. We're a pretty wet state too. We receive on average about 50 inches of rain per year, making us the 14th wettest state in the country. The Potomac River in the eastern panhandle of West Virginia, which drains to Chesapeake Bay, produces about 1.2 billion gallons of water per year. That's one river that represents only about a third of our state's drainage area. By all respects, we're water rich. We have an abundance of water, particularly in a time of climate change where 2/3 of the United States is actually becoming warmer and drier. But what happens if we think about our water resources through the lens of water security? Water security is much more than just thinking about the total volume of water that we have to work with. Water security thinks about the acceptable level of water-related risks to humans and ecosystems, coupled with the availability of sufficient water quantity and water quality, to support livelihoods, to promulgate security, human health, and ecosystem services. So when we think about West Virginia through this lens of water security, particularly floods, pollution, and degraded ecosystem function of our aquatic resources, West Virginia is in fact very insecure. Not that our water insecurity is completely driving the breakdown of our social systems, but it certainly does contribute to that. Businesses don't want to move to West Virginia because there isn't reliable water for economic production or to support the health and wellness of their workforce. So we have a breakdown of social systems, we have chronic health, we have a dearth of opportunity, we have brain drain, and all of this is embedded in the inability for West Virginia to move forward to provide for its citizens. So again, West Virginia, despite our large amount of water quantity, is quite water insecure. Recently, the Natural Resource Defense Council published a report called Water Down Justice that looked at violations of the Safe Drinking Water Act, a federal policy that is used to protect those of us that drink water from community water systems. 36 of West Virginia's 55 counties were amongst the top offenders in the country related to drinking water. So 912,000 people in West Virginia consume water that doesn't meet the Safe Drinking Water Act criteria for human health. In fact, following the release of this report back in September, the Gazette-Mail, the newspaper in Charleston, West Virginia, our state capital, had an editorial that basically said, forget broadband internet. How is West Virginia supposed to compete in a national or global business climate when communities don't have reliable and safe water? Around that same time, the current administration, the Trump administration, rolled back clean water rules that are designed to protect communities in rural areas and urban areas alike from pollution. And what this rollback essentially has done is has disregarded the connectivity of our small mountain streams to providing water to large navigable river and waterways downstream that economies depend on. So thinking about flooding in West Virginia, most recently, or not most recently, but recently in June 2016, we had a catastrophic flooding in southeastern West Virginia, nominally in the Greenbrier River Valley and that part of West Virginia. And this storm dropped 7 to 10 inches of rain over a 24-hour period. It impacted about 1,500 square miles of West Virginia landscape. There were 23 fatalities associated with the storm, and there were 1,500 homes destroyed and 4,000 homes impaired, and about 125 businesses destroyed as a result of this storm. That generated $100 billion in damage to infrastructure alone, let alone the disruption to the economy based on the workforce not being able to go to work for various reasons. Incidentally, since June 2016 of that fateful storm and November 2019, West Virginia has logged more than 600 storms over that roughly 3-year period, causing over $160 million in property damage alone. So how can we be secure in our water resources when we have vulnerable communities that experience recurrent flooding? A couple of examples of floods since the 2016 storm, on August 3rd in 2017, February and April 2018, and July 3rd, 2019 were all catastrophic storms that impacted people's lives and impacted our economy. So clearly, it's time to rethink West Virginia's relationship with water. And usually part of this talk, again, I talk about the opportunities of where we can move West Virginia forward, recognizing the importance of our water, not only to West Virginians, but also to downstream economies and downstream communities and ecosystems. But again, the focus of this talk is really going to talk about what climate change means for water security in West Virginia. And we can talk about how we can reshape our relationship during the question and answer period. So the outline of this talk is going to discuss what climate change is and why it matters, what climate change looks like in West Virginia, what are the potential consequences of climate change, and what does that mean for vulnerability for West Virginians. And then we're going to briefly explore different resources to understand climate change here in West Virginia specifically. A quick note about the fabulous work that the WVU Mountain Hydrology Lab does. We have an awesome cadre of undergrads, grads, and postdoc scholars that contribute to work. And the purpose of the West Virginia Mountain Hydrology Lab is to study both ecosystems and people and communities in West Virginia and understand how they respond to change. Our goal is to provide the public and decision makers with a science-driven understanding of our water resources, and with the goal of increasing health, resilience, and sovereignty of West Virginia's communities, ecosystems, and economies based on just practices and policies. And we're interested in elevating the importance of West Virginia across the region, the nation, and the globe. And most critically, we are here to enjoy and share the amazingness and potential of West Virginia. In one sense, it's one of the best kept secrets. Many of you live in West Virginia and know about West Virginia, so I don't need to tout all of the potential of this place. So what is climate change? This map shows for the globe anomalies or departures away from a long-term mean. And what you see is areas that are bluer in color show a trend of cooling relative to historic conditions, and areas that are warmer in color, yellow and orange and red, show a greater warming relative to the long-term average. And what you can see is across the globe, we see areas that are warming and cooling. But the critical thing to recognize is climate change is a change, a departure away from normal conditions. And if we add up all of the observations of climate measured over the last upwards of, we'll say 100 years, and we take the long-term average across all of these thermometers that use physics to measure temperature, and we take the average of that, what we see is globally, the average air temperature has increased by about 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit. So that is what we mean by climate change, is a departure from long-term average conditions. It's critical to understanding that warming is driven by humans. We can see in this figure here, if we were to model the Earth system in the absence of human factors, we could see that climate would be relatively stable over time. But when we incorporate human factors that are nominally or mostly through the production of food and energy, we can see that indeed climate has increased precipitously related to humans' presence on growing food, producing energy, and disturbing the global system. Now, there is no crystal ball on the future, but fortunately we have science, and we can use coupled Earth system models and ocean models and atmospheric models, which are all constrained by physics, to model what the future could look like. And so this figure here shows different alternative futures for emission scenarios across the globe. You can see that there's this red emission scenario, which is called RCP85, that in a sense quantifies or projects what the future would look like with unabated global greenhouse gas emissions, which for all intents and purposes represents our current trajectory. We could also see down below this blue RCP26 and the yellow RCP45. These represent what the future could look like if we have global consensus on mitigating greenhouse gas emissions. Now, again, we don't have a crystal ball, but using these kind of constraints on kind of the worst case possible scenario and the best case scenario, we can generate what we call an envelope of decision making. We can't predict the future exactly, but what we can say with a certain degree of certainty is this is what the future would look like within this range, and let's use this range to protect people. So based on this scenarios, this future scenario where CO2 rises is going to end up result in a global temperature increase between 5 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit. This lower emission scenario where CO2 stabilizes, we're looking about a 2 to 4 degree Fahrenheit change. So the ship has sailed on global warming. We are not going to turn this around even with very aggressive activities. But what we can do is minimize the feedback associated with warming and our activities, and hopefully protect communities by having global cooperation to reduce climate change. And so I often get the question when I give these talks of why does a small change in temperature matter? Why does a 1 to 2 degree change actually matter? Well, it matters for these reasons. The atmosphere expands as it warms. You could think about when we have a balloon that we blow up with our warm breath inside of our house, and on a January day, we take that balloon and we walk outside. What's going to happen is that balloon is going to contract. So when the atmosphere warms, it expands and it increases the storage of water that can be stored in the atmosphere. So what this means is warmer air holds more water. And what this also means is that a very small change in air temperature leads to a disproportionately large change in water vapor. So a small change in air temperature means that there's a lot more water vapor that could be stored in the atmosphere. And for you quantoids out there, this relationship is actually exponential. But for those of you that don't think in those terms, just know that a very small change relates in a very large change in water vapor. So because we have a warmer atmosphere, we have more evaporation, pulling water from vegetation, from oceans, from lakes and rivers and the soils. And this translates to more intense and frequent precipitation events. There's simply more water held in the atmosphere. But this also means that we have more frequent and intense droughts because the atmosphere is thirstier. It's pulling more water from the land surface. And so this feedback is collectively referred to as water cycle intensification. There's more energy to evaporate water, to create precipitation events, and so on and so forth. So what does our climate in West Virginia look like from a historical perspective? The data that I'm presenting here is from a really great paper produced from colleagues at West Virginia University, Cutta and Hubbard. And what they did is they took 18 long-term climate stations located throughout West Virginia and summarized the results. And historically, from 1900 to 2016, we have a minimum air temperature of 41 degrees, a maximum air temperature of 63 degrees, with a mean air temperature of around 52 degrees. But it's important to break that up during different time periods. Time period of 1900 to 2016 is pretty expansive. We really can't relate to those periods back in the day. So if we break up changes in historical climate from this period of 1900 to 1958, and then 1959 to 2016, we can see that in both periods, minimum temperature has increased. In the earlier period, maximum temperature actually increased, but more recently, our maximum temperatures have decreased. Rainfall back in the 1900s had decreased, and in our time period, precipitation has increased. So this shows variability through time. So when we think about climate change impacts relative to historical period, it's really important to ask what period is relevant, what period in the past is relevant. And for us, it's during the period in which a lot of our infrastructure was developed here in the United States. So nominally, the 1950s to the 1970s is a really critical period where we see lots of dams, water conveying structures built, water treatment facilities built, and so on and so forth. But what does our climate look like in the future relative to that historic period? Well, this most likely scenario where we continue to use greenhouse gases or produce greenhouse gases unabatedly, we're looking at a minimum temperature of about 50 degrees, a mean temperature of around 62 degrees, and a maximum temperature of around 73 degrees. If we have global consensus to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, we can see we still have an increase, but not as great as the increases associated with more greenhouse gas emissions. Regardless of what the future holds, we are going to see continued warming in West Virginia and across the globe. So what does this mean for us? Well, we took this information to explore what future annual stream flow could look like. And again, this RCP, excuse me, this RCP 4.5 scenario, which represents low emissions, what we can see for different basins in the Appalachian region is that stream flow on an annual timescale across the year is generally expected to increase. Some basins, such as the Tennessee Basin, has very minimal increases through time, but others have quite dramatic increases, such as the Potomac. These different colors represent the different time periods, the near future to 2015 or 2025. Orange is 2026 to 2050, and so on and so forth. Basically, quarter-century futures. So in a long-term perspective at the annual scale, streamflow could change under low emissions. Under the high emission scenario, we also see change, but we see greater variability. We actually see annual streamflow in some basins increasing and some decreasing, and those changes different through time. We're expecting changes between a 4% reduction of streamflow in some areas and a 5% increase in streamflow in other areas. But again, what do these long-term average conditions tell us about preparing humanity for an uncertain future? It's not very helpful to talk about what a mean annual streamflow looks like in the year 2100. That mean annual streamflow reduces or dampens the variability of our extreme high flow and our extreme low flows. So the real issue with climate change is the variability of the system. How does the changes in the climate and those extremes impact humanity? And so looked at through this light of variability, West Virginia is indeed becoming warmer, but it's also becoming wetter and it's also becoming drier. And you, like many people, are probably saying, huh? How can we become wetter and how can we become drier? Well, the real story of climate change is embedded in how climate and our water resources change throughout the year. This figure shows an average daily precipitation for the last quarter of the 21st century. So day 1 is January 1st and day 365 is December 31st. And these different lines show the historic period in black, stabilizing atmospheric CO2 in blue, and then an increasing CO2 in orange. And these shaded areas represent when our trees lose their leaves, our deciduous trees lose their leaves. Whereas this white period represents when our growing season, our summer seasons, when trees are using a lot of water because they have their leaves on. This is also the time period in which humans use air conditioning the most. And so if we think about variability from a daily perspective in the future, we can see that during the period when there's no leaves on the trees, we're expecting more precipitation under both scenarios. But during the period in which humanity uses water for air conditioning and when trees are using a lot of water, we can actually see a reduction in precipitation. So hence we're seeing warming, and associated with warming, we have both wetting and we have drying associated with it. So what this means is we have increasing variability. So what does this mean for West Virginia, this increasing variability? We can look at this a lot of different ways, but for this talk, we're primarily going to think about flooding and pollution and what that means for vulnerability. We could think about it from an ecosystem health perspective, vectors, diseases, economic security, and I'm happy to talk around all of this during the Q&A, but for this talk, we're going to focus on flooding and vulnerability. So some of our most recent work has taken our future climate information, and we've used a hydrologic model to look at how daily hydrology in the future could change. The data that I'm reporting here is for the Kanawha River Basin, but we've done this for all of the basins in West Virginia. And so historically, we have about 36 events per year that fall into the top 10% of daily stream flows. So if our top 10% of daily stream flows, those represent our high flow events. And historically, from 1980 to 2003, we had about 36 events per year. Under the low emission scenario for the Kanawha Basin, you can see that the distribution of low flow events is going to change depending on where you are in the future. But nominally, under each of these conditions, we're seeing an average increase in the number of high flow days. 43 from 2020 to 2039, 36 from 2040 to 2060, and 38 and 39. So we're seeing a small increase in high flow days in the future under the low emission scenario. Under the high emission scenario, we see that those high flows could increase to 41 days, to 40 days, stay similar around 36 days, and then at the end of the century, a small decrease in high flow events to 35 days. And so these figures show how that variability is increasing in the future. So with increased high flows, we have the increase in flooding potential. And the question is then, is West Virginia prepared for more floods? And this figure to the right shows the population of West Virginians living in a 100-year floodplain. The blue color is about 2 to 4% of that county's population, whereas the red, such as in Boone County, we're seeing 19 to 22% of that population living in the floodplain. Across the state, about 7% of our population lives in the flood zone. 11% of all of our housing is situated in the flood zone. And about 30% of our census blocks have a higher increase of flood occurrence. But it's also important to think about the demographics that live in these areas. This figure in the lower right actually shows the percent of people living in that 100-year floodplain that are below the poverty limit. And what you can see is in the southwestern part of West Virginia, the coal fields, we have high poverty and we have high number of people in poverty living in the floodplain. Across the state, almost 20% of those below the poverty line live in the floodplain. So what does this mean for vulnerability? We're going to return to that. Another hazard associated with increase in high flows is the potential for dams to fail. This is a really critical one. We have about 586 dams located throughout West Virginia. And these are everything from earthen dams that are a couple of feet high up to large hardened infrastructure that we see on Stonewall Jackson Lake, Summersville Lake, and so on and so forth. And what this data, this map shows is that we have dams that represent a high hazard to failure, significant, and low hazard. If we break these numbers down, about 74% of all of our dams in West Virginia are classified as high hazard, and about 15% are classified as significant hazards. So we're seeing almost 90% of all of our dams in West Virginia have a potentially high to significant probability of failing. So this is very important considering most of our dams are used for flood control. So 89% of our dams are high to a significant hazard. Of these, about 86% of those are privately owned, and about 95% of those are locally owned. So now the question becomes is, how do we address these looming hazards on the landscape when a private individual or a private entity owns this? When we can't go to their land and say, you need to do this. Or when local governments are already underfunded and stressed, how are they supposed to mitigate the potential hazards associated with climate change? Now let's look at low flows. So similar to the analysis here in a historical period, we see that we had about 40 days per year that represented low flows. In the future, we can see those low flow events are actually increasing significantly, between 98 to 118 low flow events under the low emission scenario, and under the high emission scenario, we're seeing from 100 to 140 increases in low flow events. This has very real implications for water quality, whereas the high events have very real implications for flooding. So the question becomes, how do you plan for more high flows, more low flows, and greater variability when the infrastructure designed to keep us safe and to keep our economy running is based on last century's climate? Another question is, how do we protect the most vulnerable in our communities of color, our communities with large proportion of families living under the poverty limit, our communities that lack home ownership and have nowhere to go, or the resources to go there? To quote Jacoby Wilson, who is a very talented scholar who runs the Community Engagement and Environmental Justice and Health Lab at University of Maryland, he says climate change reveals our systematic environmental justice in our communities. Climate change is a bigger threat to folks who are already burdened by the greatest hazards. And if you haven't heard the podcast on Reveal about scuttling science, where Jacoby Wilson is interviewed, it's incredibly informative to understand the connection between environmental justice and social justice and climate change. So what are the implications of this? Again, our design specifications for the safety and health of West Virginians, everything from executing emergency response and management protocols during disasters, dealing with flood protection, wastewater management, pollution discharge, constructing roads, culverts, and bridges and dams. These are all based on last century's climate. And this figure up to the right shows the problem with not considering climate change in our policies. This is the Cheat River here in West Virginia and where the Lick Run confluences with the Cheat River. So Lick Run is a source of acid mine drainage in the Cheat, and Friends of Cheat has done a phenomenal job in dealing with acid mine drainage and reclaiming and restoring and mitigating its impact. But flows in October of 2019 in the Cheat were about 5 times lower than normal conditions. And none of the mitigation strategies or offset strategies deal with these low flows. This also increases the cost to West Virginia taxpayers for repairing our antiquated and underprepared infrastructure. It costs people in the communities and their health and wellness, and it costs the economy from disruption associated with these different extreme events, from low flows to high flows. And without taking steps to safeguard West Virginia by considering these effects of climate change, our elected representatives are unduly increasing the vulnerability of our citizens and our economy. But by including climate change discourse in our decision-making, we have an opportunity to move West Virginia forward by recognizing not only the challenges and the vulnerabilities, but also the opportunities in an uncertain future. So whether it's road subsidence or landslides or floods or water quality or inundation of our water treatment facilities, these are topics that our elected officials need to focus on to safeguard West Virginia from a future change. Just have a couple more slides here and then we're going to wrap up. But it's really challenging to talk about climate change and to provide access to all of the information, all of the data that's out there. And in response to this, our group at WVU is creating what we call West Virginia Climate Link. And West Virginia Climate Link is an online, publicly available, interactive atlas and data repository and educational resource that can be used by citizens and communities and organizations and businesses and the government to understand what climate change means for West Virginia. The overall goal of Climate Link is to raise awareness about the existence, causes, and consequences of climate change on West Virginia's communities and our ecosystems. And we want to use West Virginia climate change to enhance public discourse around climate change, to develop well-informed citizens that can vote on behalf of our needs, and to inspire personal action and collective action to address climate change in West Virginia. And so what West Virginia Climate Link will do, it provides users with data, with maps, summary tables, and learning modules to learn about what future climate looks like, what the impacts could be for our communities and our ecosystems, our infrastructure, and our economy. And so this figure shows a snapshot of what's to come, where you can explore what the historical climate looked like, what the next 20 years could look like, mid-century and the end of the century. And we're shooting to have a soft release for this later this summer, and followed by different workshops to train people on how to use West Virginia Climate Link in the classroom, in your homes, and as well in your meetings that deal with the municipalities on infrastructure, on water treatment, and our decision making. And this is for 2 different emission scenarios. So to pull it all together, the bottom line is the future is uncertain, but everything is based on our choices that we take. We don't have a crystal ball, but fortunately we do have science. Science is complicated. It can get messy. We have barriers in play that limit access to data, limit access to information. We have low data literacy in our country. We have paywalls on scientific journals. But the bottom line is we need to bring science and use science into the decision-making process, and the only way we can do that is by promulgating public discourse. What is certain? Vulnerable people are going to become more vulnerable, whether we're in West Virginia, Appalachia, or globally. The vulnerable are more vulnerable. There are alternative scenarios. We can stabilize CO2, or we can move forward as usual, but there are challenges associated with that. It requires global cooperation. We have lots of self-interest groups that are providing misinformation and disinformation and putting millions of dollars in railroading public or climate change discourse. But we also have opportunities, and I'm happy to discuss some of these opportunities in the Q&A, as I mentioned. But one question I get a lot is, what can I do as an individual? Well, in West Virginia and anywhere, the most important thing you can do is insist that your decision makers have your best interest in mind. In order to do this, you need to become educated about climate change, you need to understand the policy procedure, and you need to insist that we have a just transition as we move forward into an uncertain world. The most important thing you can do is to talk about climate change, to use resources that the West Virginia Rivers Coalition has been providing to the communities, and demand that your decision makers have your best interest in mind and not the special interest of businesses and industries that have the most to lose associated with curtailing greenhouse gas emissions. So with that, if we have time for questions, I'm happy to answer any questions. I hope we can have a discussion. To remind you, many of the resources that were presented here, I've put in a document that West Virginia Rivers has already uploaded. If you're interested in this talk, if you're interested in data, papers, or even having this talk or a version of this talk to your community group, as a public scientist at West Virginia University, the land grant institution, it's my responsibility to act in your behalf with our science. So let me know how I can help. So with that, what's next, Amber?
Yeah, we have a few questions. One here, could you explain just transition? What do you mean by just transition?
So the first caveat is there are people probably on this call that can speak more eloquently about just transitions. But in general, a just transition is recognizing that as we move away from a carbon-based economy, not everyone will have an equally fair transition away from that. So whether it be our coal miners or our businesses associated with coal mining, or our manufacturing or our industrial sectors, not everybody is going to have an equal transition away from climate change, and so, or from a carbon-based economy. So we really need to consider what our transition away from this in West Virginia and across the globe means for people that are going to be disproportionately impacted by that transition. We can't have a bunch of, left of center elitists telling West Virginians what the future should look like. We need to engage those community members. They're going to be impacted by that in the conversation, in the decision making.
Great. Another question, are there solutions within reach for West Virginia, both West Virginia and nationally?
There are solutions in reach. So, the CO2 emissions associated with electricity production gets a lot of the bad rap associated with climate change. But it's really important to recognize that your food system, our food system, has an incredible impact on the global climate. So if you were to take personal action, you should think about moving away from an animal protein-based diet and moving towards more of a vegetable-based diet. You could insist on decisions on the landscape with resources management that conserve our forests, that sequester carbon, that conserve our riparian areas, that filter water pollutants out of our runoff and keep our rivers clean. You can insist on forest reclamation and surface mining reclamation that has functional abilities to sequester, to uptake and sequester carbon. But again, the most important thing you can do is talk about climate change amongst your community, amongst your families, and insist that decision makers have your best interest in mind. To point you to a resource, it's called projectdrawdown.org, and Project Drawdown actually assembles all of the scientifically published information on how to mitigate climate change impacts across the globe, and what actions have the greatest feasibility of not only occurring, but also the greatest effectiveness in curtailing greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. So Project Drawdown is going to be a great resource.
Okay, another question about the impacts of fracking, injection wells, etc., on the water, both ground and surface.
So I think I need a little more information about that to make it a question.
They're wondering what the impacts are of fracking injection wells on groundwater and surface.
Well, we could have a whole nother talk about this, but unconventional gas development uses large volumes of water to fracture shale layers to release gas. And in West Virginia and the region, water is pulled out of our streams, rivers, and lakes, or subsidized by taxpayers, and municipal water is used. And that water is injected underground to fracture the bedrock to release that water. Very little of that water is actually recovered. That native water that we injected, it's lost to the groundwater system. But what is brought back to the surface is what we call produced water. And produced water is high in salts, in radioactivity, in metals, in chemistries that aren't normally associated with healthy aquatic systems or human systems. And so there's a tremendous burden of waste associated with unconventional oil and gas development that certainly impacts not only our water quantity, but also our water quality. And we can go into more details about that, but it's a fairly in-depth conversation. The important thing to know is that nothing is without its costs, whether it's solar power, wind, coal, gas, hydro, all of these have costs. And it's our charge as voters and as taxpayers to demand that our values are represented in how energy is created, because everything's going to have a cost associated with it.
Okay, some questions about the presentation document uploaded. So the video of the recording of this presentation will be available on our website, wvrivers.org. You'll also get an email with the recording following this presentation. Let's see what else. Oh, here's another question that came in. Would efforts to quantify the fiscal costs of climate change to West Virginia communities help to place pressure on our legislators? Is anyone using this science to perform these analyses? Like, what is the cost to communities that live in areas below West Virginia dams labeled as high risk?
So that's a great question, and that's a critical action that needs to be taken. So I am not aware of people in West Virginia specifically, or the region, that are looking at the economic costs of not only climate change impacts, but also transitioning away from carbon-based economies. Certainly it's happening at national scales and for different regions of the US and across the globe, but I'm not aware of that happening yet in West Virginia. I think most important, and that's very complex work and it needs to happen, but I think where we're at in West Virginia is, before that happens and before that information is valued, we need to increase public discourse and conversations around climate change. Not only do we have elected representatives in our state government that don't believe in science or climate change, they're actively working at undermining that. And so there's a lot of different research that needs to happen, but critically what needs to happen is citizens need to demand that we acknowledge climate change and understand what it means for us at all these different levels, including the economic impact of climate change and the economic impact of transitioning away from carbon-based economies.
Okay, a couple more questions here. Does West Virginia have compacts with downstream straits or requirements from the Endangered Species Act? I think that's related to water use.
So there is a compact in there are a couple of different compacts. There's Orsenco, which deals with a multi-state agency to manage the Ohio River, which drains about 2/3, or maybe even more, yeah, about 2/3 to let's say 75% of West Virginia. There's also a compact of the Potomac Basin, where states that are in the Potomac River watershed have a compact. But it's really interesting to look at the history of these compacts and what these compacts are able to do. There's a really interesting history in the Potomac River Basin where George Washington actually bequeathed the Potomac River Basin to a single landowner. Or excuse me, not George Washington, one of the kings in England. I have a slide on it, which I should probably talk about. So the control of the Potomac River Basin has been in dispute for about 400 years. King James II actually gave the Potomac River Basin to a single landowner in 1600. And then in 1785, there was a debate between Virginia and Maryland on who owned the river. And it's kind of gone back and forth throughout time of who has precedent to manage the Potomac River and also the Ohio River Basin. And it's a very complicated thing. We have federal rules that require Clean Water Act and Safe Drinking Water Act, but nowhere is there an enforcement policy of where Washington, D.C. can come to West Virginia and say, you need to do this to provide a more reliable, clean water source to us so we can use that. And so there are federal laws and there are compacts, but it's really challenging to actually use those as effective management tools to ensure that downstream economies are getting their clean, reliable sources of water from West Virginia. On an opportunities perspective, I think this is something that we need to consider is what role does West Virginia play in providing water to downstream economies, and how can these downstream economies invest in conservation, restoration, and protection in West Virginia? Because again, we're all connected hydrologically. So sorry, that was kind of a circuitous answer.
No, that was good. Another question, increased temperature means increased water in the atmosphere and increased cloudiness. How will this increased albedo affect temperature change and growing seasons?
So that's a really, really great question. So general circulation models or global climate models to project future climate are largely based on air pressure. And the air pressure is going to be responsible for distributing moisture and winds, as well as generating clouds. And these future models do not do a good job of predicting cloud cover in the future. That's a really, really complicated thing. So everything that we've discussed thus far don't speak to that. Now, Jason Hubbard, again here at WVU, has done some work at looking at what cloudiness means historically in West Virginia for our climate, but those sorts of things are not incorporated in these future climate models. Presumably, if we have more cloud cover because of more atmospheric water, well then we would have less evaporation from the land surface. The albedo effect, the reflection of shortwave radiation would move back out into the atmosphere, and that could create some positive feedbacks that actually keep the system cool. So all of these meteorological factors are really, really important, but our current models are limited by predicting what future cloud cover could look like with any certainty. So that's my answer to that. It's really complicated. It needs to be considered, but none of the work that I've discussed actually considers changes in cloud cover. And we're fortunate in West Virginia to have Jason and his crew thinking about that level of meteorology on what the future could look like.
Another question about the percentage of dams privately owned versus government owned. How is 86 and 95? It's more than 100%. So you said 86% of dams are privately owned and 95% local government owned. That would be more than 100%. So there's a question about
Okay,
that.
I'm sorry. Yeah. So 95%. I have to go back to those numbers. I think the critical thing to recognize is that 89% of our dams have high to significant hazard. And of those dams, a large number that have high hazard are privately owned and a large number are local government owned. I have to go back to the actual data I see what you're saying, 86% plus 95% is way greater than 100%. I need to go back to that data. But the important thing about that is we have a large number of dams that are hazardous, and our dam ownership is largely local government and privately owned. So how do we move forward with thinking about vulnerability and protecting people given the mosaic of ownership and potential hazard? And I will say that all this data comes from the National Inventory of Dams, which if you search for that, for the entire US, you can actually look at dam ownership, hazard classification, dam height, when the dam was built, what the dam is used for. So I'll need to come back to that and make that correction in future presentations, but I see where you're going with that.
Okay, and it looks like we have 2 more questions. Let's see where to go. Now we have more questions coming in. How does WVU agriculture programs work with your area of study?
So if I were to answer that from the perspective of collaboration between my group and them, we don't have any collaboration. What I can say is that climate change research largely has been absent in West Virginia. It's only been in these last 10 years or so that we're understanding what climate change means in West Virginia and what it means for ag, for forestry, for energy, for water. So we don't have any active collaborations, but our hope is by democratizing access to this climate change information and putting it in a format that anybody can access that and understand it, we're hoping that this will lead down towards more collaboration with our state agencies to bring this work and this information into making decisions. Yeah, and I will say that West Virginia Rivers has had very active discussions with House and Senate members at various levels to think about what climate change means. And I should also say that I am feeling very optimistic. The amount of energy and enthusiasm and conversations that are happening around the state over these last year or two, I think we should be proud of that. And I think it's really exciting because there's a hunger for information. And I think citizens are done with being railroaded by misinformation. People want to know what is happening and what it means for them. And so hopefully as we make this information more available and it becomes more part of our public discourse, we'll have a greater opportunity to work with state agencies, local municipalities to ensure that this information comes into the decision-making process. Great.
We have one more question I want to make sure we get to. What about the impact of climate change in aquatic biota of WF River? I'm not sure what that stands for, but hopefully you do. Did you include them in your research?
So we have used the data that we're generating through this work, we've used in a couple of different studies to study social vulnerability, to study aquatic habitat vulnerability. And we published a paper, I think it was in 2018 or 2019, that looked at what climate change meant for thermal refugia in West Virginia. And we specifically focused on the Shavers Fork watershed, which A, is a beautiful watershed, B, is a phenomenal trout watershed, and C, has been the recipient of lots of funding for restoration. And what we showed is that the cold water species in Shavers Fork do have a thermal refugia here in West Virginia. They are expected to be protected, buffered. The impacts of a warming climate are expected to be buffered by the changes in precipitation, which in some times of the year are going to be greater precipitation and other times less precipitation. And so in that resources document that I provided to Amber earlier, I actually have that paper that discusses thermal refugia in West Virginia, but can also talk more about that, offline, or if anybody wants to email me about that.
Great. Well, we're running out of time and we just have one more question. I think this is a quick answer. The way to access WV Climate Link online.
Okay, so thank you for that. I'm really excited about West Virginia Climate Link. I think it's going to really fill a void of information that's specific to West Virginia. And our goal is to have the beta version of Climate Link up and live later on the summer or early fall. When that is available to demo, we will push it out through our information networks, through the Institute for Water Security and Science at WVU, through the West Virginia Rivers Coalition, and various groups to ensure that you get that information. So hopefully that'll be live later on the summer, early fall, and you'll be able to check that out. We're really excited about that. And I would like to acknowledge the Appalachian Stewardship Foundation, which did provide funding to convert all of this data that we've generated through the National Science Foundation and create a product that's meaningful at the local scale. So thank you to ASF.
Great. And thank you so much, Dr. Zégre. That concludes our Climate and Water webinar series. We are so pleased with all of you for participating, and stay tuned. We plan to offer more webinars throughout the summer. If you're interested in our climate action campaign, please contact us. You can get on our website, wvrivers.org, or contact us through Facebook. Thank you so much, everyone.
Great. Thank you all.